Hello everyone, welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and welcome back for Season 3 of A Good Night for a Murder podcast. In terms of notoriety, this case belongs alongside the likes of H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper. His name usually comes up in both of their stories, but the truth about him is comparatively lesser known. This is the story of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream. But first, a Victorian Society tip. So, true confession, I had actually written this episode for the end of Season 2 back in February. Then the days and weeks just started slipping by and all of a sudden it was March. So I thought, okay, I'll just release this in March, which happened to be Women's History Month. But clearly that plan fell apart as well, since here we are in May. Apologies aside though, I don't see why I can't still use this content I planned for Women's History Month right now, as women's history is important all year round, especially for this podcast. So, since the subject of tonight's episode is a Victorian-era doctor, we're going to use this Victorian Society tip to talk about Victorian views of women as doctors and some female pioneers in the medical field. First, let's hear what some Victorian male doctors had to say about women entering their field. First, they were offended by women studying alongside them. One man noted a number of demoralizing spectacles he'd witnessed, including, quote, a young woman dissecting the thigh of a male subject while several male students were dissecting other parts of the same body. And another young woman with unblushing front taking notes alongside with young men, her fellow students of a lecture, exclusively devoted to the mons veneris, clitoris, and hymen. Oh my. As noted in an 1870 edition of Medical Press and Circular, ladies are all very well in their place, and that is looking after the latest Paris fashions and making tea at home. When women clapped back that female patients may be more inclined to see a female doctor, one doctor disagreed, insisting women inherently don't like other women. He said women hate one another, often at first sight, with a rancor of which men can form only a faint conception. Are you mad yet? Don't worry, I'm ready to tell you about a number of women who heard those men and didn't care. They went and did it anyway. First is Emily Blackwell, born in 1826, who became the second woman to earn a medical degree at what is now Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1854. She, along with her sister Elizabeth, established the Women's Medical College in New York City. She also established the New York Infirmary for Indignant Women and Children in 1857, created the Women's Central Association of Relief, and helped form the London School of Medicine for Women. Marie Zakrzewska, whose mother was a midwife in Germany, was born in 1829. She assisted the Blackwell sisters with starting the New York Infirmary for Indignant Women and Children. She also established the first general training school for nurses in America in 1862 within the New England Hospital. Plus, she also introduced the idea of sand gardens for children to America, modeled after those she saw in Germany. They were big sandboxes, essentially, and these would be the first public playgrounds. Lucy Sewall was born in 1857 in Roxbury, Massachusetts. She earned her medical degree in 1862 from New England Female Medical College. She also studied in London and Paris, and then went on to become one of two physicians for New England Hospital for Women and Children. She would later become director of the hospital, as well as maintain her own private practice. In 1881, she, along with 8 other women in medicine, approached Harvard about admitting women into their medical program. They offered $50,000 to get them started. That's $1.5 million in today's money. But Harvard turned them down. Harvard Medical School wouldn't admit their first class of women until 1945, and that was only a 10-year trial to, quote, measure productivity and accomplishment of women both during and after medical schooling. 1945. How embarrassing for them. Moving on, Harriet Hunt was born in Boston in 1805. She got into medicine when doctors failed to help her sister Sarah. She sought the expertise of Dr. Richard Dixon Mott and his wife Elizabeth Mott. The Motts were kind of a power couple that focused on alternative methods of rest and relaxation, as well as herbal remedies to help strengthen and cure patients. These treatments did help Harriet's sister, and she herself started practicing medicine in 1835, albeit without a medical diploma. She applied to Harvard Medical School twice, once in 1847 and again in 1849. In one instance, the new dean, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., was considering her application, but all the other men raised such a fuss over it, he was forced to turn her down. In 1853, she received an honorary Doctor of Medicine from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania. Susan Dimick was born in 1847 in Washington, North Carolina. After the Civil War, she moved to Sterling, Massachusetts, where she attended an all-girls school and, quote, undertook an ambitious reading of every medical textbook she could borrow. In 1866, she was permitted to observe the wards and the dispensary of New England Hospital for Women and Children, then eventually permitted to attend clinical rounds at Massachusetts General Hospital and those of the Eye and Ear Infirmary. She was also rejected from Harvard, but was able to receive her degree from University of Zurich in 1871. Eventually, she traveled back to Massachusetts, where she became a resident physician of New England Hospital for Women and Children in 1872. On September 1st, 1872, she opened the first graded school of nursing in the United States. She worked as a surgeon, developed a private practice in obstetrics and gynecology, and performed a number of important surgical operations, a number of which are still referenced in contemporary medical journals. And she did this all before the age of 28. She tragically died on May 7, 1875, in a steamship wreck. Sarah Josephine Baker was born in 1873 in Poughkeepsie, New York. After her father and brother died, she decided she had to support her mother and sister, so she enrolled at the Women's School of New York Infirmary Medical College. After a year-long internship at the New England Hospital for Women and Children in Boston, she began a private practice in New York City. Dr. Baker effectively waged war on high infant blindness and mortality rates in New York. From Wikipedia, Baker and a group of nurses started to train mothers in how to care for their babies, how to clothe infants to keep them from getting too hot, how to feed them a good diet, how to keep them from suffocating in their sleep, and how to keep them clean. She set up a milk station where clean milk was given out. Commercial milk at that time was often contaminated or mixed with chalky water to improve color and maximize profit. Baker also invented an infant formula made out of water, calcium carbonate, lactose, and cow milk. This enabled mothers to go to work so they could support their families. She also invented single-dose silver nitrate drops to prevent infant blindness transmitted by gonorrhea during birth. Blindness decreased from 300 babies per year to only 3 per year after this. Baker also convinced New York City to license midwives to ensure some degree of quality and worked to make sure each school had a doctor and a nurse to monitor for lice and other infections in children. If her name sounds a little bit familiar, Dr. Baker is also noted for her involvement in the case of Mary Mallon, aka Typhoid Mary, in 1907, which I covered in Season 1. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, born in 1836, was the first woman to qualify in Britain as a physician and surgeon. She'd heard of Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell's work in the United States and started working as a nurse at Middlesex Hospital in London. She then moved on to the outpatient clinic and then on to surgery. She hired private tutors for anatomy and physiology and was eventually allowed into the dissecting room and chemistry lectures. She was admitted to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, but only via a loophole which did not explicitly prevent women from enrolling. She did receive her license from there, after which the school immediately amended their policy to exclude women. She couldn't get hired anywhere, so she opened her own practice. Then she learned French so she could attend the University of Sorbonne in Paris that did accept women into their program. She obtained her degree and then became the first woman to be made a visiting physician at the East London Hospital for Children. She went on to co-found and become a lecturer at the London School of Medicine for Women, the only teaching hospital in Britain to offer courses to women at the time. She continued to work there for the rest of her career and was the dean of the school from 1883 to 1902. The last woman I'm going to tell you about is Rebecca Lee Crumpler, who was born in 1831. She was an American physician, nurse, author, and she was also Black. She graduated from New England Female College in 1864, making her the first woman of color to become a doctor of medicine in the United States. In 1865, she moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to provide medical care to freedmen and freedwomen who were denied care by white physicians. Eventually, she moved back to Boston, where she specialized in treating children, whether or not their families could pay. In 1883, she published a book of medical discourses, making her one of the first female physician authors of the 19th century. Welcome back for Season 3, everyone. Right off the bat, I want to welcome new Patreon members who joined just prior to the break, Logan, Valerie, and Aubrey. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Now, before we can get started with tonight's story, we do have to talk about some changes for Season 3. The biggest change is that instead of 2 monthly episodes, A Goodnight for a Murder will now be releasing episodes only once a month. And I understand if that is disappointing to you to hear. But I think my writing and storytelling style has evolved, so the episodes are consistently a little bit longer than they were in the beginning. The Victorian Society tips seem to have stretched in length a bit, and the Patreon bonus content seems to have filled out a little more too. I just have found my way into a style where what I want to tell you is what I want to tell you, and I can't shorten it. And along with that comes longer research time, editing time, and I just found it was taking me longer to put together episodes that met the quality of storytelling I wanted to share with you. I've said before, this entire podcast is a one-woman show, and I have a full-time job, and I am a parent. And that made it challenging to produce episodes every 2 weeks. I found myself having to publish episodes late or even skip episodes in some cases. And if there's one thing I want to do, it's to get you episodes when I say I'm going to get them to you. And to do that, I had to pull back to 1 episode per month. So going forward, season 3, there will be 1 episode per month inclusive of 1 story plus a Victorian Society tip. Housekeeper and Butler tier Patreon members, though, will continue to receive 2 episodes per month. They'll continue to receive the bonus content that accompanies every regular episode, plus a monthly Good Night Snack episode, available only on Patreon. If you're interested in learning more about the Patreon, you can visit my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. If you're unable to contribute at the $5 Housekeeper and Butler tier level for the extra content, though, and you're bummed about only getting 1 episode per month, I'm also hoping this change will allow me to post more content on social media so I can talk to you guys more often and for free on there. So please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Thank you again for being here and supporting the podcast. I really appreciate each and every one of you. And with that, let's move on to our story. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. This episode does include mentions of abortion. Please take care while listening. Thomas Neill Cream was born in Glasgow, Scotland on May 27, 1850. He would wind up being the oldest of 8 siblings. When he was about 4 or 5, the family moved from Glasgow to Canada outside Quebec City. He attended school and actually apprenticed as a shipbuilder before deciding he'd rather study medicine. So in 1872, at the age of 22, he enrolled in McGill University in Montreal in pursuit of a medical degree. From the McGill News, Thomas Neill Cream, MD.CM. 1876, enrolled in McGill's medical school in 1872 as the scion of a prosperous family and as a well-respected member of Quebec City's Anglophone community. He was a hard worker, a Sunday school teacher, and a member of his church choir with a notably fine voice. His neighbors joined with his boarding school teachers in the opinion that he was altogether a fine young man of excellent character. He left McGill a spendthrift, vain, and unpleasant in manner, avoided by his peers and arousing the distaste of his professors. One of his former instructors at McGill remembered Cream as being rather wild and fond of ostentatious display of clothing and jewelry. So it seems like Cream had quite the change of character while at McGill. Or perhaps he was finally just showing his true colors. Cream did graduate in 1876 with an MD.CM degree. An MD.CM degree is the same as an MD, it's just that McGill likes to call theirs something a little different. MD.CM is an acronym for a Latin phrase that translates to Doctor of Medicine and Master of Surgery. Also in 1876, Cream entered into a relationship with a young woman named Flora Brooks. When Flora accidentally became pregnant, Dr. Cream attempted to perform an abortion for her. But there were complications, and Flora unfortunately became very, very sick. It's at this point that Cream attempted to flee the country, but he was caught by Flora's father, who forced her to marry him in a literal shotgun wedding ceremony. And I do mean literally. Her father apparently forced him back to Flora at gunpoint. The pair did marry, but as soon as he could, Cream was in the wind again. This time he fled to London, England, and the Brooks family never saw nor heard from Dr. Thomas Neill Cream again. Flora did recover from the botched abortion attempt, but would sadly die from tuberculosis a year later. In hindsight, some question whether or not Flora was one of the doctor's first victims, though I don't personally think that to be the case. In London, he received postgraduate training at St. Thomas's Hospital Medical School. Cream failed his examinations for the Royal Colleges of Surgeons, but went on to study at the Royal Colleges of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh, where he received his diploma in 1878. After this, he accepted a position for a physician in Des Moines, Iowa, in the United States, but soon after returned to Canada, to Ontario this time, where he operated a clinic without a license. He was charged for this and pled guilty, but that didn't seem to do much to deter patients from visiting his practice. In 1879, though, a young woman named Catherine Hutchinson Gardner was found dead behind Dr. Cream's office. It was determined that she died from chloroform poisoning. I think most people are familiar with how Hollywood depicts the use of chloroform in movies and TV shows, but in real life in the 1870s, it was a little bit different. Back then, chloroform was commonly used as an anesthetic during surgeries. It became a popular choice when Queen Victoria used it during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold, in 1847. And it became widely used in surgery during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. In the movies, you'll often see someone pass out from holding a chloroform-soaked rag over their face after only a few moments. But in reality, it actually took several minutes of inhaling chloroform for it to take effect, and then you had to keep it coming. Otherwise, the person would wake up. The reason chloroform makes you pass out is because it suppresses the nervous system and slows everything down. Slow everything down too much, though, and you go into cardiac arrest. In the case of young Catherine Gardner, it was also discovered that she was pregnant. When authorities asked Dr. Cream, "Why is there a dead chloroform pregnant lady in your backyard?" he said she had come to him for an abortion, but he'd refused her. At this time in Canada, abortion had been formally banned for the past decade. Instead, he'd encouraged her to hold a local businessman who she named as the father accountable. He even produced a letter from Catherine to him identifying who the father was. But Catherine said she'd rather take her own life if he wouldn't help her, and she'd chloroformed herself to death behind his house. Catherine's family and roommates said that letter was not from her and it was forged. We all see what's going on here, right? At the very least, he tried to perform an abortion and failed, and at the other end of the spectrum, he's probably the one who got her pregnant and she was going to tell everyone, so he did away with her. Either way, for whatever reason, police did not investigate further. Sometime in 1880, he moved to the U.S. and opened a practice near Chicago's red light district. By this time, all U.S. states had laws restricting access to abortion. Now, Dr. Cream did treat a variety of patients at his clinic, but he also became known for providing illegal abortions. And in August of 1880, a patient of Dr. Cream's, Mary Ann Faulkner, died. It started at a house at 1056 West Madison Street. I'm not too sure who owned the house, but there were 3 tenants who resided at it. On the first floor was a man named George Green and his family. On the second floor, there was a black woman by the name of Hattie Mack, or Mackie. I saw it both ways. And on the third floor, in the attic apartment, was a woman named Miss Ellen Hackle. The first and third floor tenants, Mr. Green and Miss Hackle, noticed that the second floor tenant, who we'll call Miss Mackie, seems to have taken out a boarder who they described as a slim white woman. And for a short while, they noticed a man who fit Dr. Cream's description was visiting the second floor apartment 3 or 4 times a day. This excerpt that describes what happened next is from the Chicago Tribune. Towards 4 o'clock on Friday morning, an unusual noise on Mrs. Mackie's floor aroused Mr. Green, who, arising, saw Mrs. Mackie leave the house together with her children. In the afternoon, he went upon the second floor but found the door to the rooms locked. A horrible stench soon afterwards began to pervade the rooms, and Mr. Green reported the occurrence to Lieutenant Steele of the Westlake Street substation, who broke in the door of Mrs. Mackie's rooms, where the decomposing remains of the mysterious boarder were found lying upon a bed, and presented a sight which, combined with the odor, beat the officers back and forced them to rush for the open air. A search of the premises revealed the fact that the unfortunate woman's name was Mary Ann Matilda Faulkner, and that she came originally from Ottawa, the capital of the Dominion of Canada. The first and third floor tenants pointed police towards Dr. Cream. It was also discovered that Miss Mackie had left a note for Dr. Cream at a nearby pharmacy informing him that Mary Ann Faulkner had died. Police arrested both Dr. Cream and Miss Mackie. Ms. Mackie said that in recent past, Dr. Cream had performed an abortion for her, but she was unable to pay and was in debt to him. He'd recently come to her and informed her that he had a patient who was in need of an abortion, and he needed somewhere to do it and someone to care for the patient after the procedure. One source I had said Miss Mackie was actually a practicing midwife. So Mrs. Mackie agreed. She said on August 12, 1880, Dr. Cream had performed the abortion in her apartment, but the procedure had gone badly. She said Dr. Cream looked in on her for the next few days, which would account for the multiple comings and goings the other 2 tenants noticed, but eventually Mary Ann died. Dr. Cream said that it was Miss Mackie who had tried to perform the abortion, but something went wrong during the procedure and she had called in Dr. Cream for assistance. By the time Dr. Cream saw Mary Ann, she was already very sick. He'd done what he could for the girl, but she was already far too gone. He went on to say that he was confident that the pharmacist who had filled some of the scripts Dr. Cream prescribed for the girl would back him up. Unfortunately, it was a matter of he said, she said, and neither side could come up with enough evidence to prosecute, so nothing happened. Later that year, Ellen Stack, another patient of Dr. Cream, died of what appeared to be strychnine poisoning. She was taking what she believed to be birth control pills that were manufactured by Dr. Cream. Sadly, this incident went uninvestigated by police as well, even after Dr. Cream tried to blackmail a local pharmacist, alleging he'd given him medications that were tampered with. 4 months later, Alice Montgomery died in a rooming house up the road from Dr. Cream's office, also from strychnine poisoning. This was ruled a murder, but was not linked to Cream at the time. In hindsight, it seems very reasonable that due to the proximity of Cream's office, Alice may have been a victim of his as well. I want to take a sidebar for a moment here to discuss the use of strychnine. Because for a moment while researching the story, I thought, well, maybe he's just a bad doctor. I knew that strychnine's most popular use was that of a rodenticide, but Victorians were known for using some highly toxic substances in and on their body on the daily. So I looked up the medical applications of strychnine during the Victorian era, and there were some. But none were what Dr. Cream seemed to be treating patients for. If you're curious, and I know you are, some of the medical applications of strychnine included treatment of paralysis by being applied externally to the limbs or spine, eye drops or injections to treat visual disturbances as it would cause contraction of the retina and surrounding muscles, treatment of an irritable nervous system. This, I believe, was administered in a pill form, sometimes chocolate-covered, as strychnine is very bitter. Seeing as too much strychnine would paralyze the nervous system, I suppose it would indeed suppress an irritable nervous system. And this final use is wholly unpleasant. If you're at all squeamish, I suggest fast-forwarding just 20 seconds or so. Strychnine injections were also used to treat rectal prolapse as the muscles would clench and hold everything in place. If you fast-forwarded, welcome back. You're safe now. Bottom line, based on the most common treatments, Dr. Cream was not accidentally overdosing his patients with strychnine. They were intentional poisonings, and his motive will become evident shortly. About May or June of 1881, Daniel Stott started seeing Dr. Cream for epilepsy. Dr. Cream prescribed him some medication for it. But on June 14, 1881, Daniel Stott died. The cause of death was ruled to be epilepsy. While treating Daniel, Dr. Cream had grown close with the patient as well as his wife, Julia. Cream said, "I don't think this was epilepsy. I think it was some sort of poisoning." And he wrote to the pharmacist that had been providing the medication to Daniel and said he is going to sue them on Julia's behalf. Or they could pay Julia directly and she won't drag it out in court. When the pharmacist ignored him, he then wrote to the coroner, who had already ruled the death natural, by the way, and accused the pharmacist of poisoning Daniel, likely with strychnine. The coroner was like, well, this is oddly specific. Perhaps I ought to look into this closer. And he took some of the leftover medication Daniel had been taking and gave it to a dog. And the dog immediately got very sick and died. I know, I'm sorry. What this told them, though, was that they needed to exhume Daniel. When they did, they discovered he had enough strychnine in his body to kill him 3 times over. When officials questioned the pharmacist, he said, "I absolutely did not fill any prescription with strychnine. In fact, that Dr. Cream man who pointed you here has also been trying to blackmail me." Police investigate further and discover that Dr. Cream had been having an affair with Daniel's wife, Julia. It would seem that Dr. Cream gave Julia the poison directly to get rid of her husband, then they tried to get some money out of the deal by blackmailing the pharmacist. It was a poor plan, to be honest. If he hadn't gotten greedy and tried to blackmail the pharmacist, they probably would have at least gotten away with the murder. So Dr. Cream and Julia were arrested, but Julia turned state's evidence, which means she agreed to testify against Cream in exchange for avoiding jail time. Which worked, and Dr. Cream was sentenced to life imprisonment in Joliet Prison in Joliet, Illinois. A friend of Daniel's actually purchased a gravestone for him inscribed with "Daniel Stott died June 12, 1881, age 61 years, poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream." He is buried in the Garden Prairie Cemetery in Garden Prairie, Illinois. Dr. Cream's brother pled leniency for his sentence and may or may not have greased the palms of some officials and succeeded in getting his brother's sentence commuted for an early release. So in 1891, Dr. Cream once again became a free man, having served only 10 years of what was originally a life sentence. I want to take another sidebar here to call out that Dr. Cream was in prison in Illinois in the U.S. from 1881 to 1891. There is a theory that Dr. Cream was also Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was active in Whitechapel, London, England in 1888. Again, Cream was in prison across the Atlantic from 1881 to 1891. We'll discuss more why people think this later, but for now, at this point in our timeline, please notice that Dr. Cream was locked up while the Ripper murders were happening. Thank you. So, Dr. Cream is now out of prison. While he was in prison, his father died and left him an inheritance. Dr. Cream took his inheritance and new lease on life and moved to London, specifically 103 Lambeth Palace Road, Lambeth, London, on October 1st, 1891. Lambeth was described by one source as having rivaled Whitechapel as one of the city's poorest, dirtiest, and most crime-ridden neighborhoods. Why do you imagine he picked there? He also started simply going by Dr. Thomas Neill instead of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, likely to conceal his shady past. About 2 weeks after his arrival in Lambeth on October 13, 1891, he met with 19-year-old sex worker Ellen or Nellie Donworth. During their time together, he offered her some sort of drink from a bottle he produced. Later that night, Nellie became very sick, involuntarily shaking and twitching. She told her landlady, "A tall, dark, cross-eyed man gave me something to drink." Not long after, Nellie died. Her death was ruled a suicide, but the coroner received a strange letter shortly thereafter from a man claiming to be a detective named A. O'Brien. This mysterious Detective O'Brien said that Nellie's death was actually a murder, and for £300,000, he could tell him who did it. In another odd turn, a wealthy bookstore franchise owner, W.F.D. Smith, received a letter accusing him of murdering Nellie Donworth and threatened to expose him if he did not pay up. Smith, of course, escalated this to police, but nothing more would come of it. A week later, on October 20th, Dr. Cream met with another sex worker, 27-year-old Matilda Clover. Cream gave her some pills with instructions to take them before she went to bed that night, with the understanding they would help prevent sexually transmitted diseases. Matilda followed his instructions and died 2 hours later in pain and convulsing. Her death was ruled to be heart failure caused by alcohol withdrawal. After this incident, a prominent physician named William Broadbent received a letter from someone who signed their name only as M. Malone. They claimed to be able to prove that he had murdered Clover, and for £25,000, he would keep a secret. Broadbent got a little more traction with police than Mr. Smith. In this case, Scotland Yard set up a sting operation to capture the blackmailer, but when the agreed-upon time came, the blackmailer was a no-show. Next month, in November of 1891, Cream met a well-to-do young lady named Laura Sabatini. The pair were swept up in a whirlwind romance and actually got engaged. A few months later, Dr. Cream took a trip back to Quebec in Canada. The exact reasons are unknown, but while there, a curious incident occurred with a housekeeper in a hotel Dr. Cream stayed at. He noticed she was looking unwell. He approached her and offered her some pills that would help her make it through her workday. The housekeeper later reported she took one pill, but it made her feel even worse, so she threw the second away. Before returning to London in March of 1892, Cream placed a large order through a pharmacy in New York that consisted of, quote, various narcotics and poisons, mainly strychnine. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but remember strychnine did have some medical applications at the time. On October 2nd, 1892, back in London now, Cream solicited Louise Harvey outside the Alhambra Theatre. The Alhambra Theatre was a popular music hall that put on shows like aerial performances, operas, and ballets. But the shows were often risque, targeting male clientele who were allowed to mingle and flirt backstage with the performers. Cream spent the night with Louise and agreed to meet the next day at a pub. The pair did meet up, and Dr. Cream offered Louise some pills he said would help clear up her spotty complexion. He was oddly insistent that she take them just before they parted ways, but this sent up a red flag for Louise, and she only pretended to take them. Instead, while he wasn't looking, she actually threw them into the River Thames. That evening, the doctor was a no-show for their meeting they'd arranged, probably because he expected her to be dead by then. A little over a week later, Dr. Cream solicited 21-year-old Alice Marsh and 18-year-old Emma Shrivel. He spent the night with them, then either gave the two pills, likely with some cover story similar to what he'd used before, or gave them bottles of beer that he had brought with him. Both were dead by the following night. Their deaths are rumored to be caused by strychnine poisoning. Now, there very likely were rumors circulating among certain populations for some time that if a tall man with slightly cross-eyed dark eyes offers you some pills, don't take them. But this is about the time that police seem to catch on that they may have a serial poisoner in their midst, as newspaper reports from this time start to reference the Lambeth poisoner. The London Daily News reported that the police at Scotland Yard are still pursuing their inquiries into the recent cases of fatal poisoning of women in the neighborhood of Lambeth with a view to establishing a connection between the suspected person against whom the police hold a warrant. An experienced inspector of Scotland Yard has the matter in hand, and he is working with the aid of the local police and his own assistants to complete the web of evidence he is constructing in support of the case against the suspect. From the accounts which the police have received from various quarters concerning this individual, there is every reason to believe that the opinion of the detectives is correct, that he is suffering from a peculiar form of mental derangements which finds exercise in a desire to take away life. There is no other motive attributable to the cruel poisoning of Alice Marsh, Emma Shrivel, and Ellen Donworth, and as the history of the Whitechapel murder shows, the indulgence of this homicide tendency upon women in this particularly defenseless position is not singular to the Lambeth poisoner. Two things I want to point out about this clip. One is that even though Nellie Donworth's death was ruled a suicide, she has now been included amongst the victims of the Lambeth poisoner. The second is, please notice that this clip says, as the history of the Whitechapel murder shows, the indulgences of this homicidal tendency is not singular to the Lambeth poisoner, meaning others have indulged in these crimes before. Others who are not the Lambeth poisoner. Those living during this time did not think the Lambeth poisoner was Jack the Ripper. Anyway, back to our story. Police learned that this tall man with dark crossed eyes going around handing out pills usually refers to himself as Fred. Police are also aware of the blackmail letter received by Dr. Broadbent after Matilda Clover's death. Though that death had been ruled as having been natural causes, this blackmail letter claimed it was a poisoning. It seems like Dr. Cream may have been a little rattled by all of the attention the Lambeth poisoner is receiving, so in an attempt to throw suspicion on someone else, he reportedly told a friend that he knew that Donworth, Clover, Marsh, and Shrivel had all been poisoned by his fellow lodger, a medical student named W.J. Harper. He went so far as to write a letter with a fake name to Harper's father accusing him. For all the effort he seemed to go to distance himself from the crimes, though, he also couldn't seem to stop talking about them. About this time, Cream made the acquaintance of a police officer visiting from New York City who mentioned the recent poisonings he'd seen in the news. Dr. Cream said yes, he'd heard all about them, then proceeded to take the officer on a walking tour of the homes of all the victims. Likewise, that officer made the acquaintance of a Scotland Yard officer while in London and mentioned to him he'd met this guy, a Dr. Neill, who was very keen to talk about the poisonings and seemed to know a lot about the victims. After this, Scotland Yard started looking into Dr. Neill and noticed he had a habit of visiting with sex workers, plus they found out he'd previously been convicted of murder by poisoning in the U.S. By June 3, 1892, police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Dr. Thomas Neill Cream for the murder of Matilda Clover. On July 13th, he was formally charged for the murders of Matilda Clover, Nellie Donworth, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrivel, attempted murder of Louise Harvey, extortion, and a handful of other charges. They were not taking any chances to let him get away. The trial was held from October 17th to 21st. Do you remember that he actually had a fiancée this whole time? She doesn't play much of a part in the story, but apparently she did testify that Cream had asked her to write some of the blackmail letters for him. He'd framed it as kind of a practical joke of sorts. Anyway, it took the jury 12 minutes to deliberate and return with a verdict of guilty on all accounts, and Cream was sentenced to death. The execution was held on November 15, 1892 at Newgate Prison. The Toronto Globe reported that probably no criminal was ever executed in London who had a less pitying mob awaiting his execution. The sentence was to be carried out by James Billington. Billington started his career as an executioner in 1884 in Yorkshire and succeeded James Barry as the chief executioner of Great Britain and Ireland just the year before Dr. Thomas Neill Cream would step to the gallows. As Billington reached to pull the lever on the trapdoor of the gallows, he says Cream started to speak, but the door opened before he could finish his sentence. He claims Cream's last words were, "I am Jack," before he was cut off by the noose. Many other officials were there to witness the execution. No one else heard this. Billington claims it to be true, but many suspect he just wanted to take credit for being the one to execute the infamous Jack the Ripper. Cream was buried on the prison grounds, then disinterred in 1902 and moved to London's Municipal Cemetery, where he was buried in an unmarked grave in section 339. His medicine/poisoning kit that was taken into evidence is now, I believe, on display at the Crime Museum in London. Now, we have arrived at the point in this episode where we're going to talk about if Dr. Thomas Neill Cream and Jack the Ripper were the same person. You likely have already guessed my stance on this, which is no, they are not the same person. For some reason, people seem to really want them to be, but the evidence just doesn't add up. First, Cream was in prison during 1888 while the murders in Whitechapel were happening. I feel like that should be enough reason in itself, but some people like to theorize that since it's possible he and his family may have bribed his way out of prison, what if he paid a double to serve a sentence instead? This is a very, very big reach, if you ask me. As one source put it, such notions are extremely unlikely and contradict all known evidence given by the Illinois authorities, newspapers of the time, Cream's solicitors, Cream's family, and Cream himself. As casebook.org, the eminent source on ripperology, puts it, most refute the theory on the grounds that Cream was a poisoner, not a mutilator. It would make little sense for him to poison his victims before 1888, suddenly go on a murderous and vicious mutilating spree in that year, and then revert back to poisoning his women. His prison sentence only adds more fire to the argument of the skeptics. So far as the very dramatic story of James Billington being the only one to hear Cream almost admit to being Jack the Ripper, I think he made that up. He had just stepped up as the chief executioner for all of England and Ireland, and he wanted the notoriety of executing Jack the Ripper, or the illusion of it anyway. And I guess it kind of worked, because here we are, still talking about it. I'm curious to know what you think, though. If you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know there. I've posted some photos of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, newspaper headlines, and more on Instagram and TikTok. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. While you're on the website, you can sign up for the Good Night for a Murder newsletter. Each month I send an episode roundup, reveal of next month's episodes, and other goodies like extra Victorian Society tips, book recommendations, and more. The bonus content for Housekeeper and Butler tier Patreons for this episode is the story of another bad Victorian doctor. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. Kim, and to accompany episode 38 about Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, I have the story of another bad Victorian doctor. This is the story of Dr. William Palmer. William Palmer was an English doctor who in the 1840s and 1850s also had a bit of a gambling problem. Particularly, he liked horse races. There was an incident in 1846 where he challenged a friend to a drinking contest. Later that night, the man was carried home where he died in bed before morning. Could be coincidence, but Palmer did initiate the challenge, and it was the word about town that Palmer had an interest in the man's